de su programa Work and Travel 2024. La idea es que esta información ustedes la repliquen con sus compañeros y sobre todo que entiendan mucho más del proceso. De pronto nosotros las agencias hemos pecado al omitir mucha información respecto a esto porque no es nuestro core, o sea, no nos dedicamos a hacer impuestos y eso ha permitido que muchas personas inescrupulosas estén formando empresas, lo pongo entre comillas, por la ilegalidad de sus actividades, ¿no? Entonces la idea es que ustedes puedan conocer el proceso y cuando les llegue el momento de que alguien les diga es que yo tengo un amigo que hace impuestos, el parcero que me hizo los impuestos hace un año, pues les llegue porque eso va a llegar, o si ya les llegó, que pues en nuestro caso fue una persona inescrupulosa que se robó sus correos, bueno, pues en algunas de nuestras comunicaciones y les ha enviado notificaciones de que es una agencia que se dedica a recuperarles bonos y eso. Vamos a hablar sobre las implicaciones que eso tiene pues a su futuro. La idea no es ponerles pues miedo, ¿no? Sino explicarles en verdad en qué consiste el proceso y especialmente pues que ustedes puedan tomar una decisión como pues, se dice en economía con información perfecta. Ya, pues es la conciencia de cada uno y los riesgos a los que se someten, ¿listo? Vamos a esperar un minutico más y ya arrancamos con esto, ¿listo? Well, we're almost done, Anna. We're just going to wait for one more minute and then we will start.
Great, thank you.
Hi, Anna. I think that we can start already.
Great, thank you. Do you want me to share my screen or did you want to share on your end?
Oh, absolutely. You can share your screen.
Okay, perfect. Okay, it says an error is occurring with the screen sharing on my end. Let me try once more.
I'm sorry?
I think an error was it said that there was an error with sharing my screen, but let me see if this works now.
Okay. If it's fixable, you can just like log off and log in again.
It's just saying we can't share your screen. An error has occurred when screen sharing. So I'll jump out and I'll jump back in and see if that helps. It doesn't seem to be allowing me to share screen. I don't know. Do you want to try and share on your end, and I can chat through the slides if that works? It seemed to work for you, Sebastian, at the start of the call.
Sure. I'll request someone on my team to do that.
Okay, thank you.
¿Puede por favor compartir la presentación?
Great. I can see that on my end, so hopefully everyone else can see it on their end as well. But just to say thanks everyone for joining this session. The aim of today is to bring you through everything you need to know about non-resident tax as a J1 visa holder as we prepare for the 2024 tax filing season. And you can go to the next slide. And just a quick introduction, my name is Anna Fitzpatrick and I'm an account manager at Sprintax. You might have seen me on previous sessions before. If not, it's nice to meet you all. Before we start, just some general housekeeping. If you do have questions, we can address them likely towards the end of the session. Feel free to use the chat and I can address them towards the end. Also, because it's tax we're talking about, we generally have to start off with some type of a disclaimer. And this presentation is aiming to give you all a general understanding of tax as it applies to J1 visa holders in the US. But it is important to keep in mind that each individual has a unique tax position. You're all different from each other from a tax perspective, and you're responsible for your own tax determination and tax compliance. But looking at what I'll aim to cover, I'll look at an overview of tax for non-residents on J1 visas, looking at things like residency for tax purposes and who needs to file a tax return. I'll look at guidance around employment and receiving US income for non-residents. We'll also look at the implications of not filing or misfiling. Many of you may be familiar with Sprintax, but I'll go through using Sprintax to assist with tax compliance. And then, as I mentioned, we can do some Q&A towards the end. So generally a good place to start when we're looking at the tax filing season is the important dates. And when it comes to the 2024 tax filing season, we're looking at the 2024 tax year. So we're looking at the period of January 1st to December 31st, 2024. We're looking at any income that you earned, any taxes that were withheld on that income, any presence that you had in the US. And ultimately, the aim is to see if you might have over or perhaps underpaid tax to the IRS or to the state tax authorities. Just to mention that the 2024 tax filing season won't kick off until around the end of January of 2025, and the tax filing deadline will be April 15th of 2025. Next up, looking at what determines residency for tax purposes. This is definitely a concept that can tend to confuse a lot of J1 visa holders. So first important thing to mention is that it is independent of your visa or immigration status. So generally, if you're on a J1 intern, trainee, summer work travel, camp counselor, au pair, teacher, or researcher visa, you're typically considered a non-resident for 2 out of the last 6 calendar years in the US. Then also as a non-resident for tax purposes, you're treated differently. Different tax rules apply to you, and you need to complete different tax forms to that of a US citizen or a resident. Then if you've been in the US for longer than that 2-year period, the IRS will use a residency test called the substantial presence test to determine your residency for tax purposes. And essentially, this test looks back on the last 3 years, and it's looking at a calculation of your days of presence to figure out, are you a resident or are you a non-resident for tax purposes? The good news there is that on the Sprintax system, we do have resources to help determine your residency for tax purposes. So the first step will ask you for all of your residency details from your first date of entry. And with that detail information, our system will then determine your residency. If you are a resident, the system will let you know and will point you in the direction of TurboTax to file a resident tax return. This is then just a useful residency summary table with some of the common visa types, as well as the number of years that you'd be exempt from the substantial presence test, or the number of years of non-resident status that you'd have, as well as some details on FICA exemption, which I will go through shortly. But the big question really is who actually needs to file anything when it comes to tax filing season. And importantly, every non-resident needs to do something and has some type of IRS filing obligation. The minimum is generally going to be Form 8843, and this form needs to be filed by all non-residents who were present on US soil as a non-resident for tax purposes on an F, J, M, or Q visa status. And it needs to be filed even if you didn't earn any income during the tax year. But in many cases, you may be receiving taxable US sourced income. So for example, if you're working as a J1, you're likely going to have income coming in to yourself. And with that, as there is no personal exemption meant for non-residents, and as there is no standard deduction as well for most non-residents, if you earn anything over $0 of taxable income, you'll generally trigger a federal filing requirement, which will be Form 1040-NR. Then for anyone who was here back pre-2020, or maybe you might see the 1040-NREZ in published blogs and things like that, that was a tax form that was used in prior seasons, but it has been discontinued since the 2020 season. So let's look at some of the common types of income that will typically trigger a filing requirement. We have your classic for J1s, your employment income, if you're getting wages, salary, compensation, or maybe if you have an investment account, you're receiving investment income or cryptocurrency in the US. Then scholarship for expenses outside your tuition is probably less common for J1s, but just to mention, if you do receive anything outside like a tuition payment, maybe for a J1 student, if we have any on, that'll typically trigger a filing requirement. And then it's not just your employment types of income and so on. It could be less common types of income, like if you went to Vegas and you got gambling winnings, or you took part in a focus group and you received a gift card. All of the above will be taxable and will trigger a federal filing requirement. But another big question we do get asked by a lot of J1s is what income does not trigger a filing requirement for non-residents. So one being money transferred from parents and relatives overseas. So if you receive money from a parent or from a relative to assist you with the cost of living when you're in the US, that's generally going to be non-taxable and won't trigger a filing requirement for non-residents. Secondly, then income earned in your home country. So for example, if you had a job before moving to the US and you're receiving your final payslip, for example, that's generally going to be non-taxable, non-reportable for non-residents, because as a non-resident, you're generally only taxed on and required to report your US sourced income. So if you receive foreign sourced income from outside the US, from your home country, for example, it generally will be non-taxable, non-reportable. Then interest on your regular savings account, generally a small amount, but also shouldn't trigger a filing requirement for non-residents. And then lastly, again, probably less common for J1s, but just to mention it, if you received any type of a scholarship or fellowship grant, for example, for services or for activities performed outside the US, it's generally treated as foreign sourced income and won't trigger a filing requirement. So this is an important slide then on some of the income documents you might expect to receive to report your taxable income during the tax year. So the W-2 is going to typically be the most common for your J1s. It's going to report things like taxable wages, salary, compensation that you earned during the tax year, as well as the taxes that were withheld on that income. And the deadline to receive your W-2 for the 2024 tax year will be by January 31st of 2025. The next one, 1042S, again, might be less common for J1s, but just to mention it, if you received anything like tax treaty exempt income, or you got a prize or an award, for example, or maybe you had taxable stipends, these are generally going to be reported on a 1042S. And if you are going to receive one, you will receive it by March 15th, or you should receive it by March 15th of 2025. But again, not everyone will receive this, and it's probably less common for J1s to receive it. Last but not least, the 1099 series documents, they should typically be less common for non-residents, but you might receive one to report things like rental income, investment income, commissions, for example. And then just to mention, if we did have any J1 au pairs on the session, it's very unlikely that you will receive an income document, but you should keep a record of all the payments made to you by your host family so you can report this on your return. Just a quick note then on non-resident spouses and dependents. So there are no joint returns for non-residents. If you're a non-resident and you're married to another non-resident, or you have non-resident dependents, you would need to file separately. And the obligations remain much of what we've discussed up to this point, the minimum being the 8843. And if you receive income, you need to file separate Form 1040 NORs. Where this changes then is if a non-resident is married to a resident, you can elect to file jointly on your resident spouse's tax return. We would just recommend doing the math on both options first to see which is more favourable for your personal tax position. So up to this point then, when I've talked about things like residency for tax purposes, who needs to file a tax return, that is all on the federal side. And when it comes to the state tax side, states have their own individual state tax rules and state residency rules. Some will say you only need to file if you earn over a certain threshold, whereas others will say you need to file from the very first dollar. So it will completely depend on your own circumstances as well as that state. But the good news here is that when you're using Sprintax, the system will be able to figure out if you need to file for state or not, as well as prepare your state tax return. This can be another common question that we get from a lot of J1s is what happens if I don't have a social security number when I'm filing? So maybe you were here for the summer, you went through all the effort to try and get your social security number, but maybe you just didn't receive it in time and you've gone back to your home country. If this is the case, you can apply for an ITIN, an individual taxpayer identification number, when you're filing your tax return. So the thing here is that if you receive income and you need to file a tax return, you either need a social security number or an ITIN or an application form for an ITIN. So this process will be that you will need to have an ITIN application form completed and signed, which is Form W7, and Sprintax can help prepare that for you. And then you'll also need to attach a certified copy of your passport. So if you're still in the US, options for certification would be an IRS official or a certified acceptance agent. Or if you're back in your home country or outside the US, it'd typically be a US embassy or consulate or the governmental department that issued your identification document. And you'd file your ITIN application with your federal tax return and with your attached copy of your certified passport. So looking at employment and receiving income, during the tax year. First important thing to mention is that the IRS does require federal tax withholding on all US source payments made to non-resident aliens, and the amount that you will pay in tax will be dependent on your income level. So, for example, if you earn anything from $0 to $11,600, that'll be taxed at 10%. And you may also have state tax withholding depending on the state and depending on your circumstances. FICA taxes then is an important one to mention. It's essentially a tax, it's also known as Social Security and Medicare, but it's a tax that is paid into that will assist with the cost of healthcare when you get to a certain age in the US. But as a non-resident on a J1 visa, it's unlikely you'll be here long enough to enjoy the benefits of that tax. And as a result, non-residents on J1 visas should not be paying FICA. Now, it's not a blanket rule. If you were on a J1 or a J2 TN visa or a H1B visa, you would be subject to FICA from the first day of your employment. And also, if you are here long enough to be deemed a resident for tax purposes, you'd also be subject to FICA taxes. So if it happens, and it does often happen with J1s, where maybe your employer isn't aware of this and might withhold FICA incorrectly, if they do, there are opportunities to claim that back. The first point of action is to reach out to your employer and request the FICA refund from them. If they refuse, you can apply for the FICA refund with the IRS using Form 843 and 8316. And Sprintax can help with those forms as well. And then the table just kind of outlines the significant impact that that can have if your employer does withhold that tax incorrectly from you. So highlighting the importance of making sure that your employer is aware of your tax position from the first point of payment and taxes you correctly to save you any hassle or long wait times trying to get the refund back. Moving on then to implications of misfiling or also not filing. So if you're listening to this session and maybe you're thinking, I didn't file last year, I didn't know I had to, or maybe you're thinking, I filed incorrectly before, I didn't know I couldn't use TurboTax or other resident providers, what do I do next? So we'd always say don't panic, but do set the record straight. If you forgot to file for previous years, you can catch up and back file at any stage, and we would recommend that you do so as soon as you can. And the good news there as well is that if you're due a tax refund in the previous 3 years, the IRS are happy to issue that to you. Then if you maybe misfiled, so for example, if you used TurboTax or another resident provider in the past, but you are a non-resident for tax purposes and you filed incorrectly doing so, you would need to file an amended return, which is with Form 1040X, the amended US individual income tax return, and you'd need to file an amended return for all incorrect years. And if you do need help with both backfiling and amending your returns, Sprintax can also help here too. So another question we'd get from J1s is what happens if I don't file or what happens if I misfile? So firstly, as a non-resident, as you all know, you're required to comply with all US laws, including that of the IRS and filing tax forms. It's also part of maintaining your visa status, being tax compliant. And one that I've mentioned here and that we continue to emphasize is the potential impact it could have on your future immigration status. So if you might be thinking of staying in the US, trying to return to the US, applying for a change of status down the line, tax is really the easiest thing to check whether someone was tax compliant or not. And we would hate to see tax being something that would prevent anyone from staying or returning to the US. So with that said, tax compliance is key here, and making sure you are filing a compliant return for all years you trigger a filing requirement is extremely important. Then on top of that, if the IRS are owed money, they're definitely going to want their cut, and they're definitely going to add fines and penalties and interest. And also you might be missing out on a tax refund. A quick note also to be careful about some of the options that might be recommended to you. First thing to mention is around TurboTax. I've mentioned them a couple of times. They're a great company, but TurboTax can only support resident returns. So if you are a non-resident for tax purposes, you cannot use TurboTax because that would be misfiling and filing an incompliant tax return. and also would lead to you needing to file an amended tax return. So if you filed using TurboTax in the past incorrectly, again, to mention that you would need to amend your return. And if that's the case, you're not alone. We have helped over 12,000 non-residents amend their returns over the last 3 years. And then also just to mention that we do see a lot of maybe social media groups where individuals or small companies are saying that they can file your tax return for you and get you the maximum refund, for example. We would definitely say to do your legitimate research here and make sure that you're filing a compliant tax return, because we've seen a lot of cases where these people or companies are filing incompliant tax returns, essentially committing tax fraud, and we don't want to see anyone getting caught up in that. So just to make sure that you're doing legitimate research on finding non-resident alien tax providers. So lastly then, looking at using Sprintax to prepare your tax returns. So for anyone who's not familiar with Sprintax, we can support non-residents with their general tax compliance needs, including things like filing and preparing your federal tax return, state returns, Form 8843, FICA returns, for example. And many of you may receive communication from your agent or your sponsor or your employer even with regards to Sprintax. So keep an eye out for that in the new year. Follow any links provided. If you don't receive anything, you can of course just access Sprintax from the Sprintax website, and you can log in or set up an account. Then once you select the tax year you need help with, we will ask you for your residency details. So the first step is always going to be around residency. So we'll ask you about your current visit, previous visits, entry and exit dates, and visa types. And if you are a non-resident for tax purposes, you'll simply be able to continue to the next step. But if you've been here long enough to be deemed a resident for tax purposes, we'd stop you at that point, we'd let you know, and we would point you in the direction of TurboTax to file a resident tax return. So for anyone who's not sure on their residency, you can complete this step free of charge. And if you are a resident, the system will let you know and will redirect you towards TurboTax. Then we'll ask you if you received income. If you say yes, we'll ask you what income documents you received, as well as the quantity of each. And you'll be able to either manually enter them or upload them into the questionnaire here. Also, again, not too sure if we have any au pairs, but just to mention that if you are an au pair, this page will look slightly different to you because it's unlikely you received an income document. So we'll typically ask you about the amounts of income you received from your host family. Also to mention here, support. So we do have 24/7 live chat during tax filing season. So if you need to reach out, you can feel free to access the support widgets. And we also have a help center there as well. I mentioned this back on the state tax slide, but as well as helping on the federal side, the system can also help on the state tax side. So the system can determine if you need to file for state or not, as well as prepare your state tax return. Then you will reach the order breakdown, where we'll give you a summary of the services that have been provided to you. For example, a federal return, state return, or other. And if you had any discount code from a sponsor, agent, employer, for example, you can feel free to enter it and validate it here. Then once you make any payment or enter any code, you're not done just yet. You will actually need to go through the process of filing your returns. So on the federal side, we do offer federal e-filing for those who are eligible to e-file their federal return. If you are, that's great. You'll go through the e-file authentication and ideally successfully e-file your return. However, the eligibility criteria for who will and will not be eligible to e-file is in the hands of the IRS. So if you're not eligible by IRS standards, you won't see this option, but we will provide you with completed tax forms. You can go to the next slide. So you'll receive a tax pack similar to this, where we'll outline next steps, including printing, signing, mailing to the address provided. You'll also have your completed tax forms as well as next steps outlined. Similarly, on the state tax side, these will need to be mailed, but again, you'll get detailed instructions on next steps and making sure that you do follow those to file it compliantly. Then lastly, before some Q&A, other support. I've mentioned some of this throughout, like your 24/7 live chat, for example. We've lots of educational videos on our YouTube channel, so feel free to check that out. We have tons and tons of blog content for tax awareness. We've tax workshops and webinars just like this one, and we'll be hosting more in the new year. And the last system that I haven't mentioned is Sprintax Forms. And this is a software that can help on the pre-employment side. For example, if you're starting employment and you want to help make sure you have the correct documentation from a tax perspective to help make sure you're taxed correctly, this system can help. So it can determine your residency for tax purposes, your tax treaty eligibility, and whether you should be paying FICA or not, as well as generating your pre-employment tax forms like your W4, W8 Ben, 8233, for example. And essentially all you'll need to do then is print them, sign them, provide them to your employer to help make sure you're taxed correctly on your income. But with that said, I'd like to thank everyone for joining. I know we're just before the holidays, so appreciate everyone taking the time out of their day to join, and happy to see if there's any questions that anyone might have, and I'm happy to address them.
Well, thank you so much, Anna, for your time and for that wonderful presentation about Sprintax and the services that you can provide for the J1 taxes purposes. We're going to make a quick, Q&A, questions and answers space. So some of our participants can actually make questions to you regarding their tax situations. Mm-hmm. Do you want me to translate, or like most of them? I mean, all of them have been on the program already, so their English skills should be enough for asking those kind of things.
Yeah, whatever works. I mean, if there's anyone who's more comfortable speaking in their native language, and if you want to translate, then that's totally fine.
Sure. Chicos, ¿quieren hacer ustedes mismos las preguntas o quisieran que yo se las tradujera? ¿O quieren escribirlas en español por el chat y yo las pregunto en inglés? ¿Cómo les gustaría más? ¿No tiene preguntas? ¿Todo quedó súper claro? Para mí todo quedó claro. Bueno, seems that everything is clear. I'm just going to take 5 minutes to make some clarifications regarding some things. And
okay.
Then I'll let you know. Bueno, ya varios de los chicos se han salido, los que no, regálenme un minutico. Después de eso, pues se pueden ir a continuar con sus vidas. Los participantes que son de Spirit, los que viajaron este año con Spirit, tienen los servicios de Sprintax incluidos. Los impuestos estatales, los federales, y pues para las ciudades que necesitan impuestos, Spirit ya pagó por su consultoría con ellos, así que lo ideal sería que pues ya empezaran a crear su cuenta, a recaudar sus W2. Respecto a las fechas de entrega de los W2, usualmente los empleadores los envían en físico a las direcciones que ustedes registraron en un documento que firmaron al principio de su temporada, que se llama W4. Entonces, cuando ustedes llegaron, que empezaron a firmar un poco de papeles, les hicieron firmar uno que se llama W4, y la dirección que pusieron ahí, que cuando hicimos el pre-partner orientation, les dijimos que fuera la de Colombia, entonces ustedes pusieron las de Estados Unidos, les van a llegar ahí. Sin embargo, hasta enero, febrero, van a poder solicitar una copia de ese documento por medio magnético, ¿no? O sea, que se las envíen a su correo. Ya con eso, pues ahí sí pueden empezar su proceso. Solo pueden hacer una declaración hasta que tengan todos sus W2. ¿Listo? Entonces, si trabajaron en 4 o 5 lugares, en 1, en 2, tienen que tenerlos todos listos. También asegúrense que su número de seguridad social esté incluido en ese documento, o sea, que sí sea el de ustedes. Si no está, sí va a ser un problema recaudar esos impuestos. Hay muchas personas que se dedican a la promoción de ayudarles con sus impuestos, que pues no son conscientes de las implicaciones legales que estas pueden llevar. ¿Cómo funciona y qué es lo que hacen ellos? lo que hacen es que diligencian el formulario, que no es para participantes J1, y pues en términos fiscales y de procesamiento, ustedes actúan como si fueran ciudadanos estadounidenses. Pero el IRS pues no es bobo. Puede que ustedes les den los bonos, pero se los van a cobrar. Se los van a pedir con intereses. Puede que este año no. Pues igualmente pues, los notifican vía correo a la dirección que ustedes pongan en ese formulario. Pero cuando ustedes quieran normalizar una situación migratoria en Estados Unidos, es decir, que se van a quedar como estudiantes, que se casaron, etcétera, un montón de cosas que después de 10, 15 años, por fin, por su trabajo, se van a radicar permanentemente en Estados Unidos, van a tener que pagar ese dinero con intereses. Entonces, en verdad no vale la pena que ustedes, siendo tan jóvenes, se embalen en un problema fiscal, porque pues el IRS es la DIAN de Estados Unidos, pues tan jóvenes y sobre todo que de pronto ustedes no sepan, pero defraudar al IRS es un delito federal. Si hay algo a lo que le tienen miedo a los gringos es a los crímenes federales y por esos crímenes hay extradición. O sea, digamos nosotros que venimos de un país tan permeado por la violencia y el narcotráfico, pues extraditan a la gente con una orden de una corte de la Florida. Una corte federal se los pueden llevar súper rápido, pues no es tanto que los vayan a extraditar. Pero pues sí, la idea es que ustedes sean conscientes de ese riesgo, que digan, pues que nosotros les explicamos, no es como los chinos lo van a meter preso, sino que pues nos ayuden a infundir este mensaje y que la gente pueda tomar la mejor decisión posible respecto a cómo hacer sus impuestos. Ahora, Aaron pregunta que en qué momento los empleadores envían los formularios. Usualmente los envían a la dirección que tú pusiste en tu W4, o sea, cuando empezaste a trabajar con ellos, la dirección que pusiste. Si pusieron la de Colombia, puede que este documento se pierda. Entonces, lo mejor es que ustedes por ahí, de 15 al 30 de enero, le envíen un correo diciendo que, pues, que por favor les haga llegar una copia de su W2. No todos la van a facilitar, van a haber empleadores que son bastante desentendidos de este tema. Digamos, si tuvieron segundos empleos, sobre todo con los segundos empleos pasa mucho, de que no les actualizaron el número de seguridad social, o que la persona en contabilidad ya no está, que si les sirve bien y así no, que no les contestan. Entonces, pues si pueden empezar a crear ese puente de como, hola, porfa, me gustaría saber con quién tengo que hablar para mi W2 el próximo año, sería maravilloso. ¿Listo? ¿Más preguntas, chicos? ¿Algo que comentar o ya quedamos por AP? ¿Ahora quedaste bien con la respuesta o necesitas algo más? Sí, gracias. Ok. Bueno, pues chicos, un abrazo. Feliz Navidad. Thank you so much, Anna, for your time. We're gonna keep like promoting Sprintax and like the wonderful services through our social media, just to advise and making all of our participants aware of all the risk of not filing properly their taxes.
Great, and appreciate you having us on today. And if there's anything additional we can give in terms of support, feel free to let us know. Awesome. But otherwise, wishing everyone a happy holiday season.
We're gonna send an email with to the participants that went to the Work and Travel program that participate with Spirit regarding their accounts and like how they can activate their Sprintax account and how they can properly fix their taxes with you.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And anything additional for support for anyone who's not with Spirit, we're happy to provide.
Okay, absolutely. Thank you so much for your time, man.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone. Merry Christmas and have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too. Merry Christmas, everyone. Bye now.